I need to tell you something that happened to me 23 days ago that's going to sound absolutely impossible, but I swear on everything I hold sacred that every word is true. I was sitting alone on the cliffs of Big Sur at sunset, completely consumed by questions about whether an all-knowing God could actually experience regret about his creation, when Jesus appeared beside me and revealed his stunning answer about what God regrets most about creation that will shock you to your core and transform everything you think you know about divine sovereignty and what breaks God's heart most about the world he made. What he showed me didn't just challenge my theology about God's perfection. It completely revolutionized my understanding of divine vulnerability and gave me insights about God's relationship with creation that are more stunning than anything I'd ever imagined about the cost of giving humanity free will and what that freedom has produced in the world. But before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps give me the strength to speak my truth. Now, let's get into my story. I'm recording this from a peaceful overlook at Point Reyes National Seashore in Northern California, where I'm taking a quiet morning break during a retreat focused on understanding God's character and the mystery of divine emotions. It's a breathtaking Saturday morning, and I'm sitting on a wooden bench overlooking the Pacific Ocean, watching waves crash against ancient cliffs while seabirds soar overhead and marine fog drifts lazily across the water. The California coastline stretches endlessly in both directions, and there's something about being surrounded by the raw power and beauty of creation that makes you wonder about the heart of the one who spoke it all into existence and what he truly feels about the world he made. I should be preparing for this afternoon session on the sovereignty of God, but I can't focus on anything except what Jesus revealed to me about what God regrets most about creation that has completely stunned me with understanding of divine nature that I never could have anticipated. Let me tell you about the theological crisis that brought me to my breaking point 23 days ago. For weeks leading up to that evening on the Big Sur cliffs, I had been wrestling with what I can only describe as profound confusion about whether a perfect, all-knowing God could actually experience regret about decisions he had made regarding creation. It started during a late-night conversation with a philosophy professor who had visited our set to discuss the theological implications of portraying Jesus as both fully God and fully human. Our discussion turned to the difficult question of divine foreknowledge and whether God's complete knowledge of future events meant he could never truly regret any aspect of creation, since he knew exactly what would result from every decision. Jonathan, he said with a kind of intellectual precision that both illuminated and troubled, if God is truly omniscient and knew exactly what would happen when he created the world, every war, every tragedy, every moment of human suffering, then either he doesn't actually regret anything because it's all according to his plan, or his regret suggests limitations in his knowledge or power that challenge traditional concepts of divine perfection. His question hit me like theological lightning because it exposed a tension I'd never really grappled with: the apparent contradiction between believing in God's perfection and acknowledging the biblical passages that seem to suggest divine regret about creation, like Genesis 6:6, where Scripture says, "The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled." That night, I began examining every biblical reference to divine regret and found myself increasingly puzzled by what seemed like genuine expressions of God's disappointment with aspects of creation. If God truly regretted making humanity before the flood, if he experienced sorrow over the evil in the world, what did that reveal about his relationship with creation and his foreknowledge of how human free will would be used? I began researching everything I could find about divine regret, God's relationship with creation, and what theologians called the problem of evil in a world created by a perfect God. But instead of clarity, I found competing theological perspectives that ranged from complete denial of divine regret to full acceptance of God's emotional vulnerability regarding creation. Some traditions insisted that God couldn't truly regret anything because regret implied either lack of foreknowledge or poor decision-making, both of which contradicted divine perfection. Others argued that true love necessarily involved the risk of disappointment and that God's regret was evidence of his genuine care for creation rather than detached sovereignty. The mystery became consuming during our filming of scenes where Jesus expressed sorrow over human choices, his weeping over Jerusalem, his anguish over betrayal, his grief at the tomb of Lazarus. Every expression of divine disappointment felt hollow because I couldn't understand whether God could genuinely regret aspects of the world he had created. If God knew everything that would happen when he created the world, how could he authentically regret human choices? But if he didn't truly regret anything, what did that say about the biblical descriptions of his sorrow over sin and his grief over human suffering? After one particularly challenging scene where Jesus expresses heartbreak over human hardness of heart, Dallas Jenkins approached me with a thoughtful expression. "Jonathan, your performance captured Jesus' sorrow beautifully, but I'm curious, when you think about God's relationship with creation, do you believe he ever genuinely regrets decisions he's made about the world? Or do you think his regret is something different?" His question exposed the emptiness at the center of my theological understanding. I could represent divine sorrow dramatically, but I had no real comprehension of whether that sorrow included authentic regret about creation itself. That night in my trailer, I had what can only be described as a theological crisis about divine regret and whether God's perfection was compatible with genuine disappointment about aspects of the world he had made. God, I prayed in desperation, I need to understand whether you actually regret anything about creation. I need to know if your perfection means you never truly wish things had been different, or if your love means you experience genuine disappointment about how the world has turned out. 3 days later, I made an impulsive decision to take a spiritual retreat along the Big Sur coastline, where the raw beauty and power of creation seemed like the perfect place to seek God about his relationship with the world he had made. Something in my spirit was crying out for understanding about divine regret that went beyond theological speculation and touched God's actual heart about creation. The Big Sur coastline was one of the most spectacular expressions of natural beauty on Earth, where ancient cliffs met endless ocean under skies that seemed to touch the edge of heaven. If anywhere could help me understand God's heart about creation, it would be this place where the majesty and terror of the natural world were displayed in their most dramatic form. For 3 days, I hiked coastal trails and spent hours in prayer and reflection, seeking understanding about God's relationship with creation and whether his perfection allowed for genuine regret about decisions he had made regarding the world. But instead of answers about divine regret, I found that my questions were leading to larger mysteries about the nature of divine love and whether creating beings with free will necessarily involved the risk of disappointment. On my 4th evening along the coast, I found myself drawn to a cliff overlook that provided a panoramic view of the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon. I sat on those cliffs as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed too beautiful to be accidental, too magnificent to be the result of random processes. I sat on that cliff and felt overwhelmed by the majesty of creation. Spread out before me, the endless ocean, reflecting the evening sky, the rugged coastline carved by millennia of waves, the sense of standing at the edge of something vast and eternal that spoke of divine creativity and power. That's when I did something I'd never done before. Instead of asking God to help me understand his sovereignty or his love, I asked him directly to tell me what he regrets most about creation. "God," I said aloud on those Big Sur cliffs, my voice carried across the ocean by the evening wind, "I need to know what you regret most about creation. I need to understand whether your perfection means you never truly wish things had been different, or whether creating this world involved risks that led to genuine disappointment about how things have turned out." The cliff was quiet except for the distant sounds of waves crashing against rocks below and the gentle rustling of coastal grasses in the ocean breeze. I felt like I was sitting at the intersection of divine majesty and divine vulnerability, desperately needing someone to unveil the truth about God's heart regarding the world He had made. I see the beauty of what you created. I continued, gesturing toward the spectacular sunset, painting the ocean in brilliant colors, but I also know the reality of suffering, evil, and brokenness that exists in this same world. I need to understand what you feel about the gap between what you created and what it has become. The silence that followed felt different from ordinary evening quiet. It felt pregnant with truth about to be revealed, like the moment before the most stunning revelation about divine nature was about to be shared. I had moved beyond trying to understand God's love theoretically to asking about His actual emotional experience regarding creation. If there are aspects of creation that genuinely cause you regret, I whispered, voicing the question that had brought me to this magnificent cliff overlooking the ocean. If your love for the world includes disappointment about how it has turned out, then I need to know what wounds your heart most about what you made. Because I need to understand the cost of creating beings with free will. What I didn't know was that my honest question about what God regrets most about creation was about to be answered in the most stunning way imaginable. Because at exactly 7:34 p.m., as the sun touched the horizon of the Pacific Ocean and began to paint the sky in colors that seemed beyond earthly possibility, the atmosphere on that Big Sur cliff began to shift in ways that would transform my understanding of divine nature and give me access to truths about God's heart that are more stunning than anything I'd ever imagined about the emotional cost of creation. The air became thicker, more alive, charged with a presence so full of divine complexity that my questions about regret began to feel like the beginning of the most stunning discovery about the vulnerability that perfect love created. The temperature didn't change, but reality itself felt more transparent, as if I was about to witness something that would revolutionize not just my questions about divine regret, but my entire comprehension of what it cost God to create a world where love could be chosen or rejected. And then, sitting on the cliff beside me as naturally as if He had been contemplating creation's beauty and brokenness all along, was Jesus. His presence filled that overlook with such overwhelming sense of divine love and divine sorrow that my questions about regret seemed suddenly like the most important inquiries about the most complex truth in existence. He was looking at me with eyes that held both infinite joy over creation's beauty and profound sadness over creation's brokenness. Someone who had been intimately involved in creating the world and who experienced both its glory and its tragedy with perfect intensity. "Jonathan," he said, his voice carrying both the authority of divine creativity and the tenderness of someone whose heart was moved by creation's beauty and wounded by creation's suffering. "Thank you for asking about what I regret, instead of assuming that my perfection means I have no disappointments. Now I can share my heart about creation, and I promise you what God regrets most about creation will stun you because it reveals the emotional cost of giving humanity the freedom to choose love or rejection, beauty or destruction, life or death." Jesus settled beside me on that Big Sur cliff, and His presence transformed the spectacular overlook into what felt like the most sacred window into the Creator's heart about the world He had made. The confusion about divine regret began to feel like the beginning of the most stunning discovery about the vulnerability that creating with love required. "The first truth about what I regret most about creation," he began, his voice filled with such profound complexity of emotion that I felt both wonder and heartbreak stirring in my spirit, "is not that I created humanity with free will. I regret that so many of my children have used that precious gift to choose hatred over love, destruction over creation, selfishness over sacrifice. The regret isn't about giving the gift, it's about how the gift has been used." I felt something stunning beginning to shift in my understanding as he continued. "When I created humanity with the capacity to choose, I knew the risk I was taking. I knew that freedom meant the possibility of rejection, rebellion, and the choice to cause incredible pain. But I also knew that without that freedom, love would be meaningless, relationship would be impossible, and the greatest joys of creation could never exist. This was already stunning me with a perspective on divine regret that was far more complex than I'd imagined. The second thing I regret most about creation, Jesus said, his eyes reflecting the golden sunset light and filling with tears, is how humanity has turned my gift of dominion over the earth into domination and destruction. I created humans to be stewards, caretakers, gardeners of a world I made beautiful and perfect. Instead, they've polluted the oceans, destroyed forests, driven species to extinction, and treated my creation like a resource to be consumed rather than a treasure to be protected. This was revolutionizing how I understood God's relationship with environmental destruction. When I see oil spills killing marine life, he explained with such anguish that I felt his pain over creation's suffering. When I watch ancient forests being clear-cut for profit, when I witness the extinction of creatures I designed with such care and delight, I regret not that I gave humanity authority over creation, but that they've used that authority to destroy rather than nurture what I made with such love. The third truth went even deeper. What I regret deeply about creation is how humanity has twisted my gift of sexuality, something I designed as the most intimate expression of love between two people, into an industry of exploitation, abuse, and commodification. The beauty I intended for marriage has been perverted into pornography, prostitution, and the trafficking of human beings. I thought about how the most beautiful gifts could become the most devastating when misused. When I created the capacity for physical intimacy, he continued with profound sadness, I designed it to be a reflection of the spiritual intimacy between souls, a picture of my love for humanity. To see it turned into violence, exploitation, and the abuse of children breaks my heart in ways you cannot imagine. I don't regret creating sexuality, I regret how it's been corrupted. The fourth truth was perhaps the most heartbreaking. I regret that humanity has used my gift of intelligence and creativity, capacities I gave them to reflect my own nature as creator, to devise ways to hurt each other more efficiently. Every weapon of war, every method of torture, every system designed to oppress others represents the perversion of gifts I gave for building, healing, and creating beauty. This was stunning me with the realization of how every human capacity for good had been twisted into capacity for evil. When I see nuclear weapons that could destroy the world I made, Jesus explained with tears streaming down his face. When I witness chemical weapons that cause agonizing death, when I observe surveillance systems used to persecute the innocent, I regret not that I made humans intelligent and creative, but that they've used those gifts to perfect cruelty rather than perfect love. The fifth truth shocked me completely. What breaks my heart about creation is that I gave humanity the gift of religion, the capacity to seek me, worship me, and live in relationship with me, and they've turned it into a tool for hatred, division, and violence. More atrocities have been committed in my name than for almost any other cause. Jesus stood and walked to the edge of the cliff, where the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, now painted in brilliant orange and gold. When I see people using my words to justify hatred, he continued with such love and pain that I felt his heart break over religious abuse. When I watch churches splitting over secondary issues while people perish without hope, when I witness wars fought in my name between my own followers, I don't regret giving humans the capacity for faith. I regret how they've perverted that sacred gift into something that divides rather than unites, destroys rather than heals. This was incredible. God's regret wasn't about the gifts themselves, but about how they had been misused. The sixth thing I regret about creation, Jesus said, returning to sit beside me, is that I made humans with such incredible capacity for love, the ability to sacrifice for others, to create families, to build communities, to care for the vulnerable, and instead, they've often chosen to love themselves more than anyone else, creating cultures of narcissism, materialism, and indifference to suffering. I realized how every capacity for good had been twisted into its opposite through selfish choices. The seventh regret that weighs on my heart is that I created humans with the gift of communication, language, art, music, literature, intending these to be ways of sharing truth, beauty, and love. Instead, they've often used these gifts to spread lies, create propaganda, and manipulate others for selfish gain. This was revealing a pattern where every divine gift had been corrupted by human choices. When I see media used to spread hatred rather than understanding, he continued. When I watch art that celebrates ugliness rather than beauty, when I witness words used to wound rather than heal, I don't regret giving humans the capacity to communicate. I regret how communication has become a weapon rather than a bridge. The eighth truth revolutionized my understanding of divine regret. What I regret most deeply is that I created time, the precious gift of days, hours, and moments, intending for humans to use it for love, growth, service, and joy. Instead, so many waste this irreplaceable gift on pursuits that ultimately mean nothing, missing the very purposes for which they were created. I thought about how time was the one resource that could never be recovered once it was gone. The ninth thing that breaks my heart about creation is that I gave humanity the gift of choice in relationships, the ability to form marriages, families, and friendships based on love rather than compulsion. Instead, they've often chosen relationships based on what others can give them rather than what they can give others, creating brokenness where I intended blessing. This was revealing how every aspect of human relationship had been affected by selfish choices. When I see marriages destroyed by selfishness rather than strengthened by sacrifice, he explained with such compassion. When I watch parents abuse children they should protect, when I witness friends betraying friends for personal gain, I don't regret creating the capacity for relationship. I regret how relationships have become ways of using people rather than loving people. The 10th and final truth was the most stunning of all. What I regret most about creation is not any specific misuse of my gifts, but that so few of my children understand how much their choices matter to me. They think their decisions only affect themselves, when actually every choice to love or hate, to build or destroy, to heal or wound, directly impacts my heart because I'm intimately connected to every aspect of creation. Jesus reached out and touched my heart, and suddenly I could feel what God felt about creation, not regret over having created the world, but profound sorrow over how the gifts of creation had been used to cause the very suffering those gifts were designed to prevent. Jonathan, he said with such love and complexity of emotion that I felt my entire understanding of divine regret being stunned and transformed. My regret about creation isn't that I made the world or gave humanity free will. My regret is that the gifts I gave for love have been used for hatred. The capacities I gave for building have been used for destroying. The freedoms I gave for flourishing have been used for suffering. I don't regret creating. I regret how creation has been corrupted. The cliff fell silent except for the sound of waves below, as this revelation began to stun me with understanding of divine regret that was more complex and heartbreaking than anything I'd ever imagined about God's relationship with creation. But if you knew this would happen, if you could foresee how your gifts would be misused, why create at all? I asked, still trying to understand how divine omniscience related to divine regret. Jesus smiled through his tears with the expression of someone who was about to reveal the most beautiful truth about divine love and creation. Because for every person who uses my gifts destructively, there's someone who uses them to love beautifully. For every act of hatred, there are acts of love. For every choice that breaks my heart, there are choices that fill me with indescribable joy. The regret I feel over creation's corruption is overwhelmed by the delight I feel over creation's beauty. He gestured toward the magnificent sunset, painting the ocean in colors that seemed beyond earthly possibility. Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is using the gift of creativity to write a song that will heal broken hearts. Someone is using the gift of intelligence to find a cure for disease. Someone is using the gift of love to sacrifice for others, The joy those choices bring me makes all the regret worthwhile. As Jesus began to fade slightly, signaling our conversation was nearing its end, he left me with the most stunning truth of all. Jonathan, what I regret most about creation reveals that my love for the world isn't theoretical, it's intensely personal, deeply invested, and profoundly affected by every choice my children make. I don't regret creating because creation allows for the most beautiful expressions of love, even though it also allows for the most heartbreaking expressions of hatred. His final words came with the authority of divine creativity and love. Remember this stunning truth. There are millions of my children who don't realize how much their choices matter to me, who think their decisions only affect themselves when actually every choice to use my gifts for love or destruction directly impacts my heart. They need to understand that what I regret most about creation isn't that I made them with freedom, it's what they've done with that precious freedom. As Jesus' presence began to fade from that Big Sur cliff, I felt like someone who had been viewing God as distant from human choices and had suddenly discovered he was intimately affected by every decision to use his gifts for love or destruction. The confusion about divine regret was completely resolved, replaced by profound understanding of how much human choices mattered to God's heart and overwhelming responsibility to use my gifts for healing rather than harm. "Thank you," I whispered as his form became translucent against the brilliant sunset, painting the Pacific in colors that seemed to reflect both creation's beauty and its complexity. "Thank you for showing me that what you regret about creation isn't that you made us free, it's what we've done with that precious freedom." His final words came with the gentle authority of divine creativity. Remember this stunning truth, Jonathan. Every person who sees you choosing to use God's gifts for love instead of selfishness will want to understand how that awareness is possible. Your transformation from confusion about divine regret to understanding how much human choices affect God's heart will become their invitation to discover the same responsibility and joy in using their gifts for healing rather than harm. And then he was gone, leaving me alone on that cliff with the most stunning understanding of God's relationship with creation I had ever received. But this wasn't just theological revelation, it was a complete transformation of how I viewed every choice I made and every gift I possessed, recognizing that how I used God's gifts directly affected his heart. The first thing I did was something I'd never done before. I spent 3 hours on that cliff, examining every talent, opportunity, and capacity I possessed, asking myself whether I was using each gift to heal or to harm, to build up or tear down, to reflect God's love or to serve my own ego. Instead of taking my abilities for granted, I began seeing them as divine gifts that could either bring God joy or cause him regret. This wasn't just improved stewardship, it was transformed understanding that every use of every gift mattered to God's emotional heart. When I returned to Los Angeles the next morning, the transformation was immediately evident in how I approached my career, relationships, and daily choices. Instead of viewing my decisions as personal matters that only affected me, I began understanding that every choice to use God's gifts for love or selfishness directly impacted his heart. The change was dramatic when I received a script offer for a project that would have been financially lucrative but morally questionable. In the past, I might have justified taking it based on career advancement or financial need, but with my new understanding of how choices affected God's heart, I saw it differently. This isn't just about whether this project is good for my career. I realized God gave me the gift of acting to reflect his love and truth, not to participate in content that perverts his gifts of creativity and storytelling into something that corrupts rather than heals. I declined the project and shared with my agent why I had made that decision, explaining how I'd learned that using God's gifts for purposes that contradicted his heart was exactly what caused him the deepest regret about creation. 2 weeks after my encounter with Jesus, I received an invitation to speak at an environmental conference where Christians were discussing their responsibility to care for creation. Instead of offering general encouragement about stewardship, I was able to share how environmental destruction was something that caused God genuine regret about how his gifts had been misused. Friends, I told the audience of 500 environmental activists and Christian leaders, 23 days ago, I wondered whether God could actually regret anything about creation. But then Jesus stunned me by revealing that what God regrets most isn't that he created the world. It's how humanity has used his gift of dominion over creation to destroy rather than nurture what he made with such love. The response was overwhelming. Instead of viewing environmental care as optional good works, people began understanding that creation care was a response to something that broke God's heart when it was neglected and brought him joy when it was honored. I've been working in environmental activism for 20 years, said Dr. Patricia Chen, but I never understood that pollution and destruction weren't just harmful to the planet. They actually caused God regret because he gave us authority over creation to be stewards, not destroyers. This gives environmental work spiritual urgency. I never realized. Pastor Michael Rodriguez was moved to tears. I've been preaching about human sinfulness without understanding that our misuse of God's gifts wasn't just disobedience. It actually wounded God's heart because he gave us those gifts to reflect his love, not to cause harm. This transforms how I help people understand the weight of their choices. 3 weeks after my encounter with Jesus, the change was evident to everyone in my life who noticed how carefully I considered the impact of every decision. My entire approach to using my talents, time, and resources had shifted from personal benefit to understanding how each choice could bring God joy or regret. Elizabeth Tabish noticed the transformation during a conversation about a charity opportunity we'd both been invited to support. Jonathan, something's completely different about how you make decisions lately. Instead of just considering what's good for you, you seem to be thinking about how your choices affect God's heart. What happened on that cliff? I shared my encounter with Jesus about what God regrets most about creation, his stunning revelation that divine regret wasn't about creating free will, but about how that freedom had been used. The complete transformation of my understanding from viewing choices as personal matters to recognizing how they affected God emotionally. I've been making career decisions based on what would advance my success, she said with growing recognition. But if God gave me the gift of acting to reflect his love and truth, then every role I choose either honors that gift or misuses it. My choices aren't just about me, they're about how I use what he gave me. George Xanthus joined our conversation with his own realization. I've been thinking about my money and time like they belong to me, but if they're gifts from God meant to be used for love and service, then every purchase and every hour either brings him joy or causes him regret based on how I'm using what he gave me. 1 month after my encounter with Jesus, I received an invitation that demonstrated how quickly spiritual transformation affects social action. A major Christian organization focused on combating human trafficking asked me to speak at their annual conference about the spiritual significance of fighting exploitation. Jonathan, said the organization director during our planning call, there's something different about your passion for justice lately. You seem to understand that fighting human trafficking isn't just social work, it's responding to something that causes God deep regret about how his gifts have been corrupted. The speaking engagement became one of the most motivating conferences I'd ever participated in, not because of shocking statistics or inspiring stories, but because I was sharing from fresh understanding of how the corruption of God's gifts directly affected his heart. Every person trapped in trafficking, I told the audience of 800 anti-trafficking advocates, represents the corruption of God's gifts. His gift of sexuality turned into exploitation. His gift of work turned into slavery. His gift of relationship turned into abuse. Fighting trafficking isn't just helping victims, it's responding to what causes God regret about how his beautiful gifts have been perverted. The response was unprecedented. Donations increased dramatically that night. Dozens of people committed to careers in anti-trafficking work, and volunteers flooded the organization after understanding that their efforts were addressing something that wounded God's heart directly. I've been leading anti-trafficking work for 15 years, said Dr. Sarah Martinez, but I never understood that we weren't just fighting crime, we were responding to God's regret over how his gifts had been corrupted. When people realize they're addressing something that breaks God's heart, it transforms advocacy into worship. 6 months after my encounter with Jesus, word had spread throughout the Christian community about my transformation from theological confusion about divine regret to understanding of how human choices affected God's heart. I began receiving invitations from churches, seminaries, and Christian organizations specifically focused on helping believers understand the weight and significance of their daily choices. "Jonathan," said Pastor Patricia Williams, who led a church heavily involved in social justice work, "your message about what God regrets most about creation is exactly what the church needs to hear. Too many Christians think their choices only matter to themselves when actually every decision to use God's gifts for love or selfishness directly impacts his heart." These speaking opportunities led to developing a comprehensive ministry focused on helping Christians understand that stewarding God's gifts was not just personal responsibility, but response to a heart that could be wounded by corruption or delighted by faithful use of divine gifts. 1 year after my encounter with Jesus, the transformation was evident in every aspect of my approach to decision-making, stewardship, and understanding of human responsibility. My ability to motivate people to use their gifts for healing rather than harm had deepened dramatically because I understood that every choice mattered to God's emotional heart. Most remarkably, I began experiencing what I can only describe as conscious partnership with God in using my gifts to bring him joy rather than regret. Every acting role, every speaking opportunity, every relationship became an opportunity to use divine gifts in ways that honored their intended purpose. "There's something different about your approach to everything lately," observed my spiritual director during one of our regular meetings. "You seem to consider every decision based on how it will affect God's heart rather than just how it will affect your circumstances." 1 year after my encounter with Jesus, I received a message that demonstrated the ripple effect of understanding human choices correctly. A seminary professor wrote to share that my presentation about what God regrets most about creation had completely changed how she taught about human responsibility and stewardship. "I was teaching students that sin was primarily about breaking God's law," she wrote, "when I should have been helping them understand that misusing God's gifts actually wounded God's heart because he gave those gifts to reflect his love. Your revelation about divine regret has revolutionized how I help future pastors understand the weight of human choices." But the most profound validation came during a conversation with Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a theologian who had attended one of my presentations and wanted to discuss the implications of understanding divine regret correctly. "Jonathan," he said with obvious excitement, "what you're teaching about what God regrets most about creation aligns perfectly with the relational nature of divine love, that God is genuinely affected by how his children use the gifts he's given them. You're helping people understand that stewardship isn't just responsibility, it's relationship with someone whose heart can be wounded by corruption or delighted by faithful use of his gifts." Now, sitting here overlooking this peaceful Pacific coastline, almost 2 years after my encounter with Jesus, about what God regrets most about creation, I regularly speak to audiences around the world about the weight of human choices and the joy of using God's gifts to heal rather than harm. The truths Jesus shared on that Big Sur cliff have become the foundation for everything I teach about stewardship, social justice, and the profound significance of daily decisions. Maybe you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in my story. Maybe you've been making choices based on personal benefit without considering how those decisions affect God's heart. Or maybe you've been taking your gifts and opportunities for granted without understanding their divine origin and purpose. Maybe you've been contributing to the corruption of God's gifts using creativity for harmful content, using intelligence for selfish gain, using relationships for personal advantage, without realizing that these choices cause God genuine regret. I want you to know that what Jesus revealed about what God regrets most about creation will stun you because it reveals how much your choices matter to his heart. God doesn't regret creating you with free will. He regrets when you use that freedom to corrupt the gifts he gave you for love. The 10 truths Jesus taught me about what God regrets most about creation have the power to transform any careless use of divine gifts into conscious partnership with God's purposes. First, God regrets that humanity has used free will to choose hatred over love, destruction over creation. The regret isn't about giving the gift, but about how it's been used. Second, God regrets that humans have turned dominion over creation into destruction and exploitation rather than stewardship and care. Third, God regrets that sexuality has been corrupted into exploitation and abuse rather than remaining the intimate expression of love between committed partners. Fourth, God regrets that intelligence and creativity have been used to devise better ways to hurt people rather than to build, heal, and create beauty. Fifth, God regrets that religion has been perverted into a tool for hatred and division rather than remaining a pathway to relationship with him. Sixth, God regrets that the capacity for love has been twisted into narcissism and selfishness rather than sacrifice and service. Seventh, God regrets that communication gifts have been used to spread lies and manipulation rather than truth and understanding. Eighth, God regrets that time has been wasted on meaningless pursuits rather than being used for love, growth, and service. Ninth, God regrets that relationships have become ways of using people rather than loving people. 10th, God regrets that so few understand how much their choices matter to him, thinking decisions only affect themselves when they directly impact his heart. If you're someone who's been making choices without considering their impact on God's heart, using your gifts for selfish purposes, or contributing to the corruption of what God created for good, I want you to understand that your decisions matter more than you realize. Every choice to use God's gifts for love instead of selfishness brings him joy. Every choice to corrupt those gifts causes him regret. You have the power to bring God joy by using your gifts as he intended, your creativity to heal rather than harm, your intelligence to build rather than destroy, your relationships to love rather than use, your time to serve rather than waste. Your faithful stewardship doesn't just benefit others, it delights the heart of the one who gave you those gifts. Father God, I thank you for the revelation that stunned me with understanding of what you regret most about creation and showed me that my choices matter more to your heart than I ever realized. For everyone listening who has been making decisions without considering their impact on your heart, I pray that they would receive the same stunning awareness of how much their use of your gifts affects you. For those who have been corrupting your gifts, help them understand that their choices cause you genuine regret because you gave those gifts to reflect your love. For those who have been taking their talents and opportunities for granted, help them recognize these as divine gifts meant to be used for healing rather than harm. For those who have been living for themselves, help them discover the joy of using your gifts to bring you delight rather than regret. Help all of us to understand that stewardship isn't just responsibility, it's relationship with someone whose heart is affected by how we use what he's given us. Thank you for showing us that what you regret most about creation isn't that you made us free, it's what we've done with that precious freedom. In Jesus' name, amen. The truth I learned on that Big Sur cliff is the truth that can stun anyone with understanding of divine regret. What God regrets most about creation isn't that he gave us free will, it's that we've used that freedom to corrupt the gifts he gave us for love. Your choices matter more than you realize because they directly affect God's heart. Every decision to use his gifts for their intended purpose brings him joy. Every choice to corrupt those gifts causes him regret. You have the power to bring God delight by using your talents, time, relationships, and opportunities as he intended for love instead of selfishness, for building instead of destroying, for healing instead of harming. Your faithful stewardship isn't just good works, it's partnership with someone whose heart is moved by how you use what he's given you. Thank you for letting me share the most stunning discovery about God's regret I've ever received. I love you all, and God loves you enough that He's given you precious gifts that can either bring Him joy through faithful use or cause Him regret through corruption. The choice is yours, and it matters more than you've ever imagined.